I would just like to see the whole thing depoliticized, and let's get back to real science.
So what about the cap and trade idea to curb carbon?
Well, okay, so here you have a derivative industry. I see a lot of parallels between that and the subprime mortgage market. Here was essentially a whole system of credit expansion presented to all of the lenders around the country with a, use it or lose it caveat. And, but if you are going to use it, it comes with all these strings attached. And what happened was there was suddenly, billions of dollars of credit dumped into the markets, and it spawned this whole derivative industry, the subprime mortgage industry.
Right.
This is parallel to that. What this is going to do is spawn a whole derivative industry that actually produces nothing, but sits astride the pipeline. You see, cap and trade is about basically imposing mandates on industry that will essentially say, here's a ceiling. You cannot exceed this ceiling. If you expel beyond this amount of CO2 into the atmosphere, you're now going to have a deficit that has to be equalized somehow. So you have to go to another industry or company that has not met the mandates, and then you trade
Right.
the difference. So it balances
opens up
out.
a new marketplace then, kind of.
Yeah, it like creates this market for these carbon credits.
Right.
Okay, so the point here is that what you will have is this gigantic middleman that will essentially be astride that pipeline. Who knows how much they'll be raking off the top, 10 or 15% of trillions of dollars of exchange that's going on. And it's going to make all of the investors and all of the people like Al Gore with his Generation Investment Management that's set up to essentially capitalize on that derivative industry once it's in place. And they will be generating billions of dollars, but just like the subprime mortgage industry, they won't actually be producing anything. What's going to be happening is they're going to be siphoning off the financial resources and making this derivative industry and its participants extremely wealthy, but it's not going to be really doing anything to affect climate change.
So, it seems like I said before, like this, with climate change being kind of the paramount interest of the environmental movement at this point, it seems like what you're saying is that that's a lot of misplaced attention.
Well, I mean, when you consider at least a third of the rivers in this country are still filthy. There are toxic waste dumps that haven't been cleaned up. Right now, we're fighting this extraordinarily destructive war in the Middle East that is creating immense environmental havoc. There are depleted uranium weapons that are being deployed. I mean, to me, there are lots of legitimate environmental concerns. This whole question of global warming based upon a slight enhancement of CO2, I think, is an enormous distraction from much more pressing issues. Not that there's not some validity to it, but if you were going to make a list of priorities, there seems to be a constituency of the environmental movement that has moved climate change right to the top of the list. But now, I think we need to be clear here, and when we're talking about climate change, I think, again, there's a term that's been hijacked, because certainly I believe climate change is a pressing issue. I believed that in the late 1970s.
But
natural climate change, and most people don't have a clue when it comes to understanding natural climate change and what that actually implies. And if in the minds of many people, anthropogenic climate change is the sole concern, they're going to be missing the real issue.
Because I think what comes across is that the climate has remained very stable, and only recently has it started to change because of things and you claim you have research that shows that that's not the case at all.
I can state categorically that is a gross misconception. Gross misconception. The climate has changed extraordinarily over thousands of years, and sometimes those changes have occurred with extreme abruptness. We can look at the end of the last ice age. If we want to talk about global warming, I like to direct people to the termination of the last ice age. Even the proponents of anthropogenic global warming, if you look at their data and what they're suggesting, they're saying that in the last century, or roughly as a consequence of man's industrial activities, average global climate has increased by about 3/4 of a degree centigrade. Well, at the end of the last, and this is over a period of about a century and a half, if you go back to the end of the last ice age, when we're talking about a period of time between roughly 11,000 and 13,000 years ago, what we discover is that there were fluctuations in climate where the temperature climbed by as much as 15 degrees centigrade. And it did this perhaps in less than 3 years.
Wow.
And then it declined as precipitously in an equally short amount of time.
And we weren't driving cars around at this point.
No, we were not driving cars around at that point. So we're looking at something completely natural. And as we go back, what we're discovering, and if anybody decides to actually become familiar with the studies and literature of paleoclimatology, the study of ancient climate, what they're going to discover over and over and over and over again from every research front is coming up with the same picture, is that Earth's climate has been extraordinarily dynamic and variable. And that we've come along actually and built this industrial civilization within a small interval of relatively stable climate compared to the big picture. I mean, if you look at what is referred to by geologists as the Quaternary, which is roughly the Quaternary period, which is roughly the last 2.5 million years, we have perhaps, the climate of the Earth has perhaps shifted into a full glacial mode and back out of that into an interglacial warmth, perhaps as many as 40 times. And nobody knows why. Nobody knows really ultimately what's driving that. See, now a shift into an ice age would be a major concern. It's difficult for people to imagine that a mere 13,000 years ago, which is just slightly beyond twice the length of recorded history. We're back in the Ice Age. Humans were alive. Our ancestors were alive, living during the Ice Age. And if you are now a resident of Ohio, Indiana, New York, New England, the Midwest, Canada, the northern western United States, if you were able to go back 13,000 to 14,000 years ago to see what the climate was like, well, the only modern analog that would even approach what the climate was like in those regions 13,000 years ago would be the South Pole. So if you're a resident of Ohio or New York, stop for a minute and think about how is it that a mere 13,000 years ago, this place where I'm now living was like the South Pole, with a mile-thick ice sheet. And that within a few thousand short years, that ice was completely gone. Now that is a consequence of global warming. We don't understand. We don't understand what drove that warming, the end of the last ice age, or the dozens of ice ages that preceded it. And what I'm saying is we may be getting hysterical over a mouse running across the floor of the room when there's a T-Rex just outside the window. The mouse is anthropogenic climate change and the T-Rex is natural climate change. And I would challenge anybody to take the time, to take several months of your spare time and actually try to learn what the scientists out there have been discovering over the last 30 years, and you'll discover that the picture is a lot more complex than that being presented to us by mainstream media.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for talking to me like this. This is really interesting information I think a lot of people haven't come in contact with before. But we'll segue into a presentation where you'll give us a chance to see some of this data that you're talking about that doesn't normally get broadcast in the channels that we tune into. So thank you very much, Randall.
My pleasure.